This is the IBJ podcast for the week of November the 7th, 2022, brought to you by Taft. I'm your host, Mason King. Welcome back to the podcast, everybody. Hopefully you are aware that the U.S. midterm elections are on Tuesday, November the 8th, although the lead up to this set of races has been nothing like what we experienced in 2020. You are forgiven if you still have something of a political hangover from that election and its aftermath. But there are many candidates for federal, state, and local positions on Tuesday's ballot that affect central Indiana residents in any number of ways. For this week's edition of the podcast, we'll bring you up to speed on four of the most interesting and consequential races. On the federal level, of course, U.S. Senator Todd Young, a Republican, is defending his seat from Tom McDermott, the Democratic mayor of Hammond, Indiana, and Libertarian candidate James Sceniak, a behavioral therapist. The race between Young and McDermott has been surprisingly close, given Young's name recognition and massive advantage in fundraising. On the state level, we have the headline-grabbing contest between Republican Diego Morales and Democrat Destiny Wells for Secretary of State. Ironically, the state position that has the most sway over elections. Morales has been hit by several troubling allegations in recent months, including sexual misconduct and embellishing his military record. There's a fascinating race shaping up in the Indiana Senate District 31, which includes the Geist area, Lawrence, and the city of Fishers. The incumbent, Republican Kyle Walker, reportedly has far outraised Democrat opponent Jocelyn Vare, but at least one poll shows that this race is a toss-up. And in Indianapolis, Marion County Prosecutor Ryan Mears, a Democrat, faces a tough challenge from Republican Cindy Carrasco. She claims Mears has been soft on violent criminals, and she has raised an impressive amount of money to get her message out. For this week's edition of the podcast, I've invited two of my colleagues from the IBJ newsroom to get us up to speed. Peter Blanchard covers politics and state government, and Greg Weaver is our government and politics editor. Here's our conversation. I'm pleased to welcome back to the podcast Peter Blanchard, who covers politics and state government for IBJ. Pete, thanks for making time.
Thanks, Mason.
And IBJ managing editor Greg Weaver, who has been covering politics and Indiana state government for several decades between IBJ and the Indianapolis Star. Thanks for making time.
Thanks for having me.
Let's start with a race that will be on all of the Hoosier ballots on Tuesday, Secretary of State. It's one of my favorite races because it's very meta, as they say. Greg, explain what the Secretary of State does.
It's primarily the chief elections officer for the state, so enforces election law, but also does other things like register businesses and corporations and things of that nature.
Our candidates are Republican Diego Morales, Democrat Destiny Wells, and Libertarian Jeff Maurer. None of them is the incumbent. That would be the current Secretary of State, Holly Sullivan. Explain why Sullivan isn't on the ballot.
She's not on the ballot because she lost in the Republican State Convention to Diego Morales, even though she was endorsed and heavily supported by Governor Eric Holcomb.
I did not realize that could happen. Like you could be an incumbent and that you just wouldn't automatically appear on the ballot the next time.
Well, and she's technically not the incumbent. I mean, she was appointed to that position because it was vacated by her predecessor. So that's one thing that happened. But also, it's one of the few statewide offices that are selected by delegates to the state convention rather than by voters in a primary.
Now, this is an unusual race because Democrats haven't won a statewide office since 2012, and the Secretary of State's office since 1990. But they think Destiny Wells has a shot at this one, and we should point out this is her first run for an elected office, which may or may not be an advantage. It's hard to tell anymore. What do we know about her background?
So Destiny Wells is from Martinsville, deeply conservative part of the state. She has said she grew up Republican, decided to enlist in the military at 19, not long after 9/11, As she told me in an interview once, she traveled the world a few times and came back a Democrat. So she's, a pretty decorated military veteran. She was deployed to Afghanistan for a time. She currently serves as an Army Lieutenant Colonel Reserve. And she's held a number of positions. She has her law degree. She worked for a brief time for the city of Indianapolis as an attorney. But this is her first time running for public office, so she's very much a newcomer, but she's had a lot of success raising money in this campaign. She's pretty much been able to stay neck and neck with Diego Morales in terms of fundraising, and very few blemishes on her record.
One of the main reasons Democrats like her chances is that Morales has been mired in a series of controversies. Can we run through them quickly? And maybe let's start with the one that was just brought up today by the Star's James Briggs.
Sure. So the story by Briggs dates back to 2018 when Diego Morales was running for Congress in the 4th Congressional District. Morales had his primary residence in Marion County, but then he also rented a condo in Hendricks County in order to say that, he was living in the district that he was running for. But this latest story by Briggs basically tries to connect the dots and say that, according to people close to Morales at the time, he wasn't actually living at the house. In 2018, he claimed a homestead deduction on his Marion County residence, which would indicate that's your primary residence because that's how you're able to obtain that deduction. So the article basically raises more questions about whether Morales was actually living in the district that he said he was when he was running in that district, and he also voted in Hendricks County in that district, and it is a felony to vote, in a district where you're not actually establishing residence.
Okay, so we have that, and that's today, but there have been several others. Go ahead.
Diego Morales, among other things, he's been accused of exaggerating his military service. He often describes himself as a U.S. Army veteran. In his Twitter avatar and in his campaign ads, you can see him wearing full military garb. A closer look at his record show that he was only enlisted in the Army for about 3 months. He had spent about 5 years in the National Guard training, but his time on active duty was very short, and it's unclear why it came to an early end before his commitment with the National Guard was over. He's also been accused of sexual assault by 2 Republican women who now work for his opponent's campaign. He's also...
Those are allegations he's denied, by the way.
The other thing is that he was, twice worked in the Secretary of State's office. One time he was fired for workplace performance issues. He's also previously called the 2020 election a scam, and he's since walked back those comments. And he's also changed his stance on early voting. So, a number of things working against Diego Morales in this campaign, but, I think he's hoping he can still eke out a win because he's Republican in a Republican state.
Now, he has spent, as we point out here, a good amount of time in Republican politics. How so?
Diego Morales has been involved in various campaigns over the years. He worked as an aide to Mike Pence during Pence's time in office. He's also been involved in politics. He ran for, as we mentioned, he ran for the 4th Congressional District in 2018, and he's had a long history of working with the Republican Party, and he's an avid campaigner. He's constantly touring the state, meeting with voters, attending GOP events in various counties across the state.
Mm-hmm. Now, usually a close race will shake out a bit after the debates or a debate. But what has happened with the debate or debates that were scheduled between Morales and Wells?
Morales just hasn't showed up, so he's declined to participate in these debates. So there's really been no sort of bounce out of them as you might expect in typical races. And I think that's largely because he doesn't want to have to address all the issues that have been raised about him over the last several months.
Is there any indication that skipping a debate hurts the candidate? I mean, there's obviously the calculus on their side was this will not be a problem for us in the end.
I mean, I think it might if it were a higher profile race, like if it was a U.S. Senate race or perhaps a race for Congress. I'm just not sure in this election cycle how many people are paying attention to the race for Secretary of State. And I think that also leaves open the question as to whether or not all the issues that are dogging Morales will actually have any impact in the election. At least, will it have an impact as much as the Democrats would like for them to have? And I think that's an open question. And I don't think we're going to know that until election night.
Did Wells and Maurer end up debating?
They did. There was a forum hosted by the Asian American Pacific Bar Association, and there was also a more high-profile debate hosted by WFYI, in which there were 3 podiums, one with Destiny Wells, one with Jeff Maurer, and then Diego Morales' podium sat empty on the stage.
What does the polling say about this race so far?
The polling shows it's very close. It does give Destiny Wells a slight advantage, but it's within the margin of error. And that's polling that was done by a firm that was doing work for Abdul Hakim Shabazz, who publishes the cheat sheet and operates indiepolitics.org. But that was fairly early in the race, and there was still a large number of undecideds in that race. And so the question is, will the Republicans who are undecided stick with the Republican candidate despite all these allegations that are outstanding against him?
What do we know about Maurer just as a candidate? And is it possible that he could play a spoiler as a Libertarian candidate if you assume that he would be attractive to some conservatives?
I think that's definitely possible, and Libertarians in previous elections have done fairly well, going as high as 7 percentage points. If he were to get 10% of the vote, then he would be able to list Libertarian on the primary ballot. So there is some momentum for Jeff Maurer, I believe, in this election. Yeah, he's also a military veteran, so you've got 3 veterans running in this race. One of his main positions is that he thinks our elections need to be audited more closely. He wants to have audits of every election after it's done, and he wants voters to be able to basically see a kind of digital receipt of their vote after they vote. It's unclear what the cost of that kind of program would be, but it's something he said he supports.
What does Morales say about how he would do his job?
So Morales wants to expand voter ID laws. In fact, in a recent tweet, he said it's time that Hoosiers be required to show their ID even when they vote by mail. Unclear how that would work, but he's also said that he wants to reduce the early voting period from 28 days to 14 days. He has since walked back that position, but he has been firm in the fact that he has said he wants to strengthen and expand the state's voter ID law.
Okay. And what about Wells?
Wells is critical of the state's voter ID law. It's not something she supports. She's kind of powerless to be able to change it because it would have to go through the state legislature. But we do know that she wants to make it easier for Hoosiers to vote. She says she wants to remove the requirement that you need to provide an excuse when you vote by mail. She wants to allow anyone to vote by mail without having to provide a reason.
Okay, let's take a quick break to hear from our sponsor. This is the IBJ Podcast.
Taft, today's modern law firm. With more than 625 attorneys across 11 offices, we provide solutions to the business issues facing middle market and emerging companies alike. We do this through a highly collaborative and inclusive team approach. Taft, the modern law firm. To learn more, visit taftlaw.com.
All right, we're back with this week's edition of the IBJ Podcast and my conversation with Peter Blanchard, who covers politics and state government for IBJ, and Greg Weaver, our government and politics editor. Okay, let's move to the Marion County prosecutor's race, where again we have 2 fairly unknown candidates, although Democrat Ryan Mears is the incumbent. Technically, how did he end up in office?
Ryan Mears was appointed by a Democratic caucus to fill out the term of Terry Curry, the former prosecutor who was becoming ill with prostate cancer.
And Mears had been in the office in various roles, I assume, for many years.
Yes, for several years.
So what is Republican Cindy Carrasco, and I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Cindy Carrasco, what is her background?
Cindy Carrasco, her first job after graduating from IU Law School, she was a staff attorney for the Office of Inspector General. Pretty soon after, she was elevated to the executive director of the State Ethics Commission, which is the bipartisan commission in the fight against government fraud and corruption. She did that for over 8 years. And then in 2015, she became the first woman to be appointed as the state's inspector general, a position she held for some time. And then most recently, she served as deputy general counsel and ethics officer to Governor Eric Holcomb.
I don't know much about being a prosecutor. I've always imagined that it would be pretty much the same for anybody. This is my Law and Order education in politics. Police catch the criminals, and then you as a prosecutor create as strong a case as you can against them. But Carrasco has pointed to many differences in how she would approach the office.
Well, I think the differences sometimes come down to perceptions. And so Cindy Carrasco would tell you that downtown is unsafe. Ryan Mears will tell you that it is safe. Cindy Carrasco would tell you that more needs to be done to fight violent crime. Ryan Mears would tell you that he has stopped prosecuting lower offenses involving possession of marijuana, and is also not pursuing cases that violate the state's strong abortion restrictions, so that he can spend more time fighting violent crime and prosecuting violent crime. But, on the other hand, Cindy Carrasco says, well, you really shouldn't just issue these blanket statements about not prosecuting these lower-level crimes. Each case should be considered on a case-by-case basis and on its merits. Those are sort of the primary differences between the two candidates. And I think the other thing that you see in their campaign commercials and the way they're presenting themselves to the electorate is that Ryan Mears makes a lot of points about how he is trying to help people who find themselves charged with lower-level crimes and have difficulty doing things that allow them to work their ways back into society and become productive members. So among the things that he's done is spend a lot of time working on trying to help people get their driver's licenses back once they've been revoked so that they can start, driving back to work again. I think it's really going to come down to how voters perceive whether or not they feel safe in Marion County. Do they think that Ryan Mears' approach is the right approach and that he's doing enough to keep them safe, or do they think they need somebody who is more, it comes off as a little more stronger law and order, as Cindy Carrasco does?
I think one of Carrasco's strongest lines of attack is to bring up the mass shooting last year at the FedEx ground facility in Indianapolis, where a gunman killed 8 people. And Mears' office was criticized for not filing what they call a red flag case against the shooter, who was known, this is prior to the shooting, this guy was known to have threatened to attack police as a kind of form of suicide. Now, red flagging the shooter might have prevented him from being able to purchase the 2 AR-15 style rifles that later that year he used in the FedEx attack. How does Mears counter this attack?
Ryan Mears has been very critical of Indiana's red flag law because he says it doesn't provide prosecutors with enough time to subpoena medical records and build a case that would be sufficient in persuading a judge that a person's rights to guns should be denied. He's also said that there's really virtually nothing you can do to keep illegal guns out of the hands of criminals in Indiana, largely because the state has been reluctant, very reluctant, to put any sort of restrictions on sales of guns at gun shows.
So how is the race shaping up? And I'm sorry, I have not been keeping track of any polling on this particular race. What does it look like right now?
I think it's really hard to say. There hasn't been any really public polling in this race. I think Mears is considered to be favored because he's a Democrat in the city of Indianapolis. I think Carrasco is sort of hoping that, people are concerned enough about violent crime and whether downtown is safe or not that they will consider voting someone new into office, in the hopes that that could change things.
I know that the fundraising in this race has been strong, I think on both sides. Carrasco raised almost $372,000 in the third quarter. She raised, I think, $577,000 since launching her campaign in January. Mears raised almost $300,000 in the quarter, and that nearly tripled his contributions of $110,000 in the previous quarter. It's even-ish, basically. Mears had more cash, obviously, in the chest prior to Carrasco entering the race. And we recently ran a story showing that Carrasco had spent probably $70,000 on local TV ads to Mears's $60,000. That isn't up to today, but I mean it gives you an indication of the kind of spending in this race. I'm going to assume that we're going to see a lot more ads between now and Tuesday.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assumption. This is typically, a county prosecutor's race wouldn't be this competitive. I think Carrasco, is due credit for helping to raise the profile of this race. They both, as you said, they've run a lot of campaign ads, and there are more to come. I'm sure our listeners have seen some of them. Their approach in ads is very different. Ryan Mears, in his campaign ads, which have all been positive, he's focused on the fact that he's, not prosecuting people for simple possession of marijuana. As Greg mentioned, he's not going to go after doctors or patients if they're accused of violating Indiana's new abortion ban. And he also likes to tout the fact that he's, doing all he can to take accused violent criminals to trial. Carrasco, meanwhile, in her ads, says crime is skyrocketing, and she blames Mears for failing to enforce the state's red flag gun law, and also blames Mears for allowing violent criminals to be released onto the streets.
Yeah, and amid all this, it should be noted that even though there are all these accusations that violent crime is up, homicides are actually down from a year ago. And so sometimes it's hard to make that argument really strongly that crime is up. Some crime may be up, but homicides are not.
Our next race includes a bit of Marion County. It's State Senate District 31, which includes, I believe, all the Fishers, Geist, parts of Lawrence. The incumbent Republican Kyle Walker reportedly has far outraised Democrat Jocelyn Vare, but at least one poll shows that this race is pretty much a toss-up. Is that still the case?
That seems to be the impression. The poll that you mentioned came out in August, basically put the race in a dead heat. And, back in 2018, when Republican Senator Jim Merritt was running for re-election, he barely won the seat, beating out his Democratic challenger by, I think, fewer than 2,000 votes. So this is a district that's become more competitive in recent years as you have younger families moving into the suburbs. This is a district that's becoming more diverse, and that tends to attract more Democrats than Republicans.
So here again, we have an incumbent who did not get the job through a general election. How did Walker become state senator?
That's right. Senator Merritt resigned in 2020. Senator Kyle Walker was appointed by a caucus to replace his term. So Walker is finishing out the end of his first 2-year term, and he's looking for another 4 years in office.
It's notable to me that Walker is one of the few, and Greg, you can help me out here, few, if any, Republicans in the Indiana State House to vote against the near-total abortion ban that the legislature passed earlier this year, as well as the bill that removed the permit requirement to carry a firearm in public. Do we have a sense at all, does that hurt him with Republican voters in that district? Does he get the rhino tag for splitting from the general GOP consensus, or is that really not an issue?
I think that district is more moderate than most, and I think that is part of the reason that he probably won't face the kind of severe backlash from the people in his district that you might if you were in a more rural conservative Republican district.
And tell me about Vare. What is her background?
Jocelyn Vare serves on Fisher City Council as an at-large member. I believe she's one of 2 Democrats on the city council. This is her first, high-profile run for public office, her first time running for statewide office. And she's basically campaigned largely on a single issue, which is abortion. She has said that, while her opponent voted against Indiana's abortion ban, he would not fight to repeal it. And she has said that's something she would do. So she's tried to differentiate herself from her opponent in those ways. And she's also, been able to raise about $120,000, which is not a lot when you look at Walker's campaign chest. He's raised $1.5 million over the last 2 years. He's been able to, flood the airwaves with both positive and negative ads going after Ver. Ver has, largely concentrated her resources on targeting voters in her district through various ads, both digitally and in print and on social media.
Okay. Yeah, I was wondering how you would combat that kind of advantage when you're out-earned by a factor of 10.
Yeah, she's basically said that Kyle Walker is, running ads on TV that in some cases, reach, 30 plus counties. And so, she likes to say, well, I'm, spending my resources specifically on constituents in my district. But of course, Walker is able to claim a greater reach with his strategy.
So finally, we would be remiss in not addressing the U.S. Senate race between Republican incumbent Todd Young, aiming for his second term in Congress, and Democrat Tom McDermott, the Democratic mayor of Hammond, Indiana. There's also a third option in James, and help me with this, Sceniak, a behavioral therapist running as a Libertarian candidate. Now, there was a debate a couple of weeks ago. Peter, how did they stake out their turf or try to frame the election?
Senator Young was often touting his experience, getting things done in Congress. He, mentioned the CHIPS and Science Act, which was legislation he championed along with Democratic Senator Chuck Schumer. He basically, wants to, show Hoosiers that, he'll fight for their vote and that he's able to get things done in Congress. He's also quick to, blame President Biden and Democrats for, frivolous spending that has led to inflation. He pins that on the other party. You had Tom McDermott really going on the offensive in that debate, really going after Todd Young at any chance he could, whereas Todd sort of is less likely to, attack his opponents. He more likes to go on his own record.
And what did we hear from Sceniak?
So Sceniak, you could sort of tell when he was on the stage that this was a bit of a new experience for him, but he certainly gave it his all.
Do we have any polling in this race? Surely, at the national level, somebody is interested in whether or not Young is doing well.
Well, the only polling I've seen is from, Abdul Hakim Shabazz. Again, it shows that this race is very close. Todd Young has a slight lead, but it's within the margin of error. Again, this was a poll that was done early on. It's poll results that surprised a lot of people. But I think it could be explained. I mean, I think most people think that Todd Young certainly has the advantage as the incumbent and in terms of his fundraising and to some degree in terms of his record on bipartisanship. But while the results were surprising, I think you can explain them by looking at the fact that a large number of people were undecided. And I think part of the reason for that is that among Republicans anyway, particularly among the most conservative Republicans, is that Todd Young has not been endorsed by former President Trump the way many other people in Congress have been. And I think that there is some reluctance within the party to fully embrace him on the conservative end of the spectrum. But I think when the election rolls around, those folks certainly are not going to vote for Tom McDermott, and I think you'll find them flocking back to Todd Young. And in the end, I've been wrong about prognosticating before, but I really expect Todd Young to carry this race by probably at least 10 to 15 points.
Well, certainly on the fundraising side, it doesn't seem like much of a contest. I think McDermott had raised $660,000 since the start of this campaign. Young had, I think, $13 million?
That's right. He knows how to fundraise.
Okay, well, guys, thanks for the overview. Give me a sense, Greg, of what our coverage is going to be like on Tuesday.
Well, we'll be following closely all the races that we've touched on today. Those are the primary races that we'll be following. But we'll have updates throughout the day regarding how things are going at the polls, what the turnout looks like. And then Peter and I and Taylor Wooten, who covers city county government for us, and also Leslie Weidenbender, who's the editor of IBJ, will be here through the night, providing all the details that you want to know. So just follow us at ibj.com.
ibj.com. All right. Well, guys, thanks so much for your time.
Thanks, Mason.
My thanks again to Greg Weaver and Pete Blanchard. And again, make sure you check out our election coverage on November the 8th at ibj.com. And before you get on with the rest of your week, there are a few stories in the latest issue of IBJ I want to draw to your attention. Noblesville leaders expect a stretch of undeveloped agricultural land on the city's southeast side to become Hamilton County's next epicenter of innovation. Daniel Bradley has the details on Innovation Mile, a 300 to 400 acre master plan district where city planners hope to attract companies in the medical, tech, biosciences, pharmaceutical, and advanced manufacturing sectors. Also in this week's issue, John Russell delves into a trend sweeping the senior living industry, providing fewer services to residents, including doing away with daily meals and transportation, which can lower rent, but also alienate residents who have relied on such services. And Susan Orr examines how IU researchers are developing virtual reality tools to aid in the treatment of substance abuse. Again, you can find these stories in the latest print edition of IBJ or online at ibj.com. I will say it is easier, however, to access all of the latest local news about business and politics and all of IBJ's data on Central Indiana's business community and economy if you're a subscriber. And here's a new development. We have wrapped all of IBJ's content together with all of the stories, columns, and podcasts from our sister publication, Inside Indiana Business. And now works out to just about $3 per week for actionable information about every notable business development across the state. You won't find Indiana's story told with this kind of breadth and depth anywhere else. Just go to ibj.com and click on the subscribe button. And thanks again for making time this week for the IBJ podcast. I'm Mason King. Hang in there, everybody. We'll be back again next week.